Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another recap of the World Chess Championship game number 6. Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces against Jan Nepomniachtchi, and this was going to be an all-important game because we're starting to get towards that midway point of the match. It's a 14-game match. All the games have been drawn so far, and actually, historically, game number 6 has been that point in previous World Championships where we have seen a decisive result before. So, getting right into things, we see the move d4 to start off. Magnus elects to go back to what he essayed in a previous game earlier in the match. Knight f6 from Jan, and we saw Catalan before, so everyone was wondering, are we going to see that repeated by Magnus? Does he have a new idea? Because he has elected to go with d4 over e4. Knight f3, d5, and g3. Right off the bat, right on move 3, this move is actually kind of confusing already, because normally you withhold this move until black plays e6. So if you play c4, e6, now g3, and this bishop can't develop. So actually in the past, g3 is kind of maybe not the top move because of a move like bishop f5. And then you get to play e6 and c6, and it's almost like a reverse London setup for black. Very solid. Bishop gets outside the pawn chain. So g3 was a little bit surprising because of that. But nevertheless, Nepomniachtchi said, I'm well prepared in my Catalan. I'm going to play e6, happy to go right back into it. And after bishop g2, again, there are other moves to consider here for black. b5 is another option. When white delays c4, b5 is another way to put a clamp on that square, play bishop b7, and go on from there. But it looks like Nepomniachtchi had a game plan. He wanted to stick to his main line Catalan. And after castle, castle, b3, we see that Magnus never had any intention of playing c4. He wanted to continue with b3. g3 is a rather unorthodox setup, and clearly there's a type of position that he's going for because the last time they played the Catalan, Nepomniachtchi got a very, very promising position. So we see c5 striking out at the center. Magnus takes and immediately challenges with c4. So after pawn takes c4, it's very clear. Nepomniachtchi's with the black pieces. He looks to be pretty much equalizing out of the opening. If white decides to trade queens or take that pawn back, I just don't see any problems with black's position. Yes, the white bishop is very strong here, but there's nothing really hindering black's development. So right off the bat, I think Nepomniachtchi is probably reasonably happy with the opening, but Magnus playing the move queen c2, and rather quickly, this was definitely part of his preparation, and I don't think Jan's moves so far are very difficult to expect. Queen e7, this protects the bishop. That's the main reason that black could not take this pawn here. The bishop would be hanging. But now, after the move knight b to d2, this pawn can be taken. And it wasn't by Jan, which begs the question, why didn't Jan play c takes b3 here? And, you see this move, knight takes b3, it hits the bishop's going to retreat, and there are a lot of moves that Magnus can play here. No doubt he had this position prepared. And if we go down one line, let's say knight d4, rook d8, knight b5, white's going to get this bishop, but, in a position like this, bishop b2, two bishops for white, but you're down a pawn, and these double pawns are not the scariest for black to take. So I just wonder if, this was really that scary, but no doubt Magnus would be very well prepared here, and there is something to be said for avoiding your opponent's preparation, because, you don't want them to be so confident. They've seen this position at home, they have it analyzed, they know it way better than you will. So I think that was an interesting decision here not to take. We just see the move knight c6. And when Magnus saw knight c6, he also took a little bit of time. He ended up recapturing the pawn, but probably he spent a lot of time really analyzing a position where he would be down a pawn. b5, a big reaction to knight c4 by Nepomniachtchi, temporarily opening up this diagonal, but with the knight attack, that simply has to be reacted to. Knight e5 going in the center of the board, also challenging this diagonal, looking to open it up, makes the most sense. Knight b4 from Nepo. That knight can sink its way back into the d5 square, and the attack on the queen gives him enough time to play bishop b7. Once we see bishop b7, the bishop is challenged on g2, and I think that Nepo's position is just fantastic. a3, knight c6, and knight d3, maybe a sort of desperate attempt to keep pieces on the board. If you're just trading with Nepo early on here, I think black is actually ahead in development compared to white, and kind of an opening success, I would argue. bishop b6, bishop g5, and yes, these pawns will get doubled, but as I mentioned earlier, these aren't really the scariest. As long as you have that pawn on e6, I always say when you have double pawns like this, it depends where the e pawn is as to whether it's okay for the guy with double pawns. So for example, if this pawn was on e5, those double pawns suddenly become terrible. White plays knight h4, attacks the f5 square. But the pawn on e6 means that these pawns are like a sort of defensive shield here. They cover everything in front of them, and these pawns are definitely okay for black. Rook c1, and we see some exchanges here. This exchange will also happen inevitably. It's really hard for either side to refuse the exchange after knight d4. So we sort of reach this position, check, king back. You don't really want to weaken your dark squares with a move like f3. Queen e4 centralizing beautifully. And I think the position is very balanced here, very equal. We see queen c2 from Magnus, taking control of the c file. And if rook c8 gets played, no doubt Magnus is planning to take that with the queen, and we would get a very interesting imbalance. 2 rooks for the queen. a5 played by Nepo, rook f to d1. I think both sides are playing very, very natural moves here. And black's position is starting to look up. There's certainly a lot of options here. But king g7, very solid move, protecting the g7 pawn. And Magnus in this position decided to go with rook to d2. It guards the e pawn, and it sort of maybe prepares queen d1, doubling on the c file. Could also double on the d file, play e3 and kick that bishop out. So it's sort of one of those flexible kind of moves, but it's really nice to be able to guard this pawn because now white might have an idea like queen c6. Trade those queens off and get into an endgame where you hope that your knight is a little bit better than that bishop. Plus, there is the slightly weakened pawn structure. So rook d2, and now b4. There were a lot of moves that Nepo could have played. This has the idea to play bishop c3 next. Also, if knight takes b4, then it would be met with something like this, where this weak pawn on b3 and e2 plus the king on f2 being exposed kind of gives black the preferable position. But it wasn't quite that move which Nepomniachtchi decided to play next. Instead, in this position, Nepomniachtchi decided to do something which is very committal, and he did it rather quickly, which speaks a little bit to his confidence in offering, with the move rook a to c8, 2 rooks for the queen. And Magnus pretty much has to take this. I mean, it is possible to play queen d1, but with bishop c3 looming and the type of moves that Magnus has been playing, it's definitely always his intention to play queen takes c8. And so what we get here is one of the most dynamic imbalances in chess. We actually have 2 of them. Bishop for knight, and on top of that, queen for 2 rooks. So you already know this is going to be a pretty exciting game because with an imbalance like that in the position, fireworks are just bound to happen. Queen d5 played, attacking the b3 pawn. And after b4, black is not going to make I'll call it a mistake, pawn takes pawn here, because what white has that black doesn't is very simply more pieces. So with the 2 rooks against the queen, the benefit of the rooks is that the rooks can gang up on one thing and attack it twice. So even if it's attacking this pawn, if the 2 rooks get down here and attack this pawn, even if the queen's defending it, white can just take the pawn. And even though the 2 rooks and queen get exchanged, white wins a pawn in the process. So the 2 rooks work really well ganging up on something. After b4, if black just takes, then the b pawn's easy to attack for white, and there's just no weaknesses. But a4 is a fantastic move. The queen thrives against the 2 rooks by attacking pawns. The queen can shuffle from side to side of the board, attacking weaknesses, pawns, weak squares, give checks to the king, and the rooks are a little bit clumsy in defending. So a4 is great. There's always going to be a queen b3 kind of move to attack a3, and this is going to challenge the white rook. So both sides understand the imbalance very clearly. e3 played, kicking the bishop back momentarily. There is like a discovered attack kind of move that you're always looking for here, but the queen is actually pinning the knight to the rook, so it's not possible. All right, this is the optimal setup for Magnus here. h4, he doesn't want h5, h4 to happen. Of course, black follows suit with h5 himself. More space for the king as well here on the h file. King h2. So these are just slow moves. There's nothing really in the position that the players need to be too concerned about. For the last couple moves, there is a move that's possible. And I was just waiting to this moment to mention it because it does appear on the board. Bishop b2. Like, what the heck is this? So definitely over the last couple moves, bishop b2 could have been played, but I'll talk about it in the moment where it was played on the board, because the idea is very direct, although the move itself is rather brilliant looking in nature. Bishop b2, and because of that pin that I mentioned, rook takes b2, queen takes d3, and you're attacking that a pawn, and white just has to tie himself fully to the defense of that pawn, and the rooks are never really going to find a way to win or get active when you're playing defense like that. So rook takes b2 was definitely playable. Knight takes b2, not playable. That hangs material there. And Magnus actually went for the move rook to c5. I think if he was just playing for a draw, you would have seen this. And, you can play rook a2 and come back with the other rook. I don't think white's playing for a win, but I also don't think black can win either. This is the only weakness. It's protected. And I think Magnus's rook c5 shows his ambition here. Queen d6 played, maintaining the pin. Everything that I just discussed involving this bishop remains intact. And now we see the move rook to d1, which surprised everyone. In this position, I want to point out something that hasn't been the case in the previous part of this match, which is that time was getting insanely low for both players, especially for Magnus. More so for Magnus now, but it evened out in the end. We're on move 32, and on move 40, the players get an extra 1 hour, but they do not enjoy 30-second increment until then. There's no increment. So when you're watching your clock expire, you're not getting any extra time before move 40. So as Magnus might have 10 minutes, 8 minutes ticking down, he's also got 8 more moves to play, which is just crazy. Like that's a lot of pressure. And we see the players start to get in that mode of, blitzing things out, and that's where you will see mistakes, and we did certainly in this match. Queen d6 allows a very, very interesting idea of rook to c2. Guarding the rook and saying to this bishop, if you go back to e5, well, move like f4 suddenly means that bishop is kind of getting trapped, right? f4, and where does this bishop go? It has to go to a1, and white has a lot of ways to try to either trap this bishop or simply move this knight now and start to get these rooks down here. Because now the rook's defended, these discovered attacks work all the time. So the idea for black, of course, is bishop takes a3, but the remarkable thing about this position is after bishop a3, the bishop's way offside, the knight's free to move now that the rook's protected, this pawn might be loose, and these rooks getting down here to attack this pawn. Practically, from a human perspective, I mean, most of us watching the game saw this and thought, wow, advantage Magnus if he goes for that. But with time ticking, he played the crazy looking move, rook d1. Now, if knight takes b2 now, the rook's protected. We get that that's a threat. But it's black's turn, so bishop a3, and suddenly these rooks, totally disconnected, they start to become an issue. When the rooks are connected, doubled, protecting each other, that's usually where they're strongest. But when they're disconnected like this, they can be forked, attacked. And we see the move queen d7, guarding the a-pawn, attacking the rook. And this is where things start to get a little bit out of hand. Queen d7, a fantastic move. Rook c5. And in this position, I'm really wondering, along with everyone else, like where was the move bishop takes b4? Because now the white rook has to move. Rook takes h5 looks completely crazy. Position like this, number one, move f5 might keep the rook from going back. But also, you've got a3, and you're still pinned here. The pawn is marching. a2, bishop c3, a1. This does not look correct at all. The rooks are still disconnected, which is really, really bad coordination. So the rook might have to come back here. But now, the pawn is just going to be advancing. The bishop is going to move somewhere. I don't know, e7, f8. It doesn't matter. The bishop moves somewhere. If this pawn gets to a3, surely black is the only one with winning chances here. So it was really remarkable after rook to c5 to see e5, first of all, by Nepo. Now, rook c2 was played. e5 is maybe not the worst move, but now the move queen d5, and we just never saw bishop takes b4 in this game. And I can only speculate. I'm not sitting there at the board as the players are. My time's not ticking down. I'm not playing the World Championship. But while I'm in my armchair on the sidelines here, bishop takes b4 certainly looks very, very strong, taking advantage of this pin. So move queen d5, surprising because now the rooks get together. This bishop's starting to look trapped in there. Queen b3, looking to play maybe bishop takes b4. And after rook a2, e4 was played, as now both players were getting very low on time. This is move 38. So with just minutes on the clock, these guys are just scrambling to get their moves out. But e4, very committal. And what happens here is the pawns suddenly get very disconnected. And after a move like knight c5, it's white who's on the offensive, attacking everything in the position. The bishop's almost trapped there. Queen takes b4, knight takes e4, perhaps missing one of the most crucial moves in the match, rook to c2. And this may allow white to play knight a4. So let's imagine f5, knight a4, rook c3. And the reason this is so devastating is, once again, two rooks against the queen. The two rooks, hopefully, will be able to attack either this pawn or this pawn, and the queen won't be able to just sacrifice for them because the king and pawn endgame will be lost. So there were definitely some chances there for Magnus to find this move, rook to c2 and knight takes a4, but also that was his 40th move. He's way down on the clock. He decides to play knight takes e4. Very reasonable. If the queen takes, the same thing happens. And after queen b3, both players had finally made the time control. So what we have in the current position is a pretty interesting dynamic. It looks like what Nepo has messed up is that he could have had his e-pawn this entire time. Bishop takes b4, that move from earlier, we would have the exact same position with that passed a-pawn, except Nepo would also have an e-pawn on the board. So the absence of that pawn gives Magnus a lot to look at in this endgame. First of all, one thing that has to be understood is that if this pawn and bishop trade for one of Magnus's rooks, that position might also simply be winning for white. So keep that in mind. If that trade can ever happen, that's pretty dangerous. Also, if the knight trades for the bishop and the pawn in any capacity, then it's also a pretty easy, immediate win for white with the two rooks and now these damaged pawns. White's even up a pawn as well in that case. So you have to be looking for how the position is going to transform as you start to see these moves come out. Magnus has a very solid position, rook defending, the other rook on d2, which defends the pawn. The knight is free to bounce around in the position. And again, sacrificing a rook for that a-pawn and the bishop is definitely going to be something on Magnus's agenda as we see this play out. Rook a to c2, bishop back, and this rook move was to activate the knight with knight to c5. And you can see, it's very tough to explain all these moves, but essentially the rooks are just fine. The pawn will get to a3, but that's it. White has control over that square, so white's not really worried about losing this game from this moment on. The knight is the piece that can jump around to any square it wants and cause havoc. Knight on f4 might have an idea of rook d5 and attacking this h-pawn. And the knight there can also reroute to e2 to d4. So the knight can pretty much go wherever it wants, and you'll see that that's exactly what's happening here. Rook d5 can certainly be played, but as you'll see, Magnus's approach is one that's very, very concrete, and he doesn't want to, play rook to d5. This move, let's say, invites a lot of complications. Yes, that pawn might be hanging, but if you go and take that pawn, you're disconnecting your rooks. We've already talked about how the rooks need to be protected. They don't need to be, but they are better when they're protecting each other and they're sort of coordinating against the same target. So as we see the game play out, bishop b4, rook d3, Magnus is all about this pawn. Again, if the queen were to just, move to c7, for example, well, maybe c7's maybe not the best because of knight d5, but my point is more that, if the queen moves to a square like this and white is able to coordinate rook takes a3. I'm really not finding a good square, so I'll use this one for now. But if white is able to coordinate something like this, while the engine might give it as a draw, I think that a position like this is actually one where white is winning the majority of the time. This pawn can be defended with knight h3. This rook will slide over to f4, and these pawns will be targeted by the rook and the knight at the same time. The queen and the king are not enough to defend. So this is always on the horizon here. King h6 guarding the pawn, rook back to d1, and rook to a1. So putting all the pressure here. And now this knight, which is the free piece to jump around, can really look to reroute. Knight e2, knight d4, knight c2, for example. There's so many ways that this knight could try to get to c2, attack that pawn, and even if it has to be a rook sack for the pawn, you'd expect that this is the winning attempt from Magnus Carlsen. This pawn's protected, but for black, there's not really much you can do. Just sort of sit tight and try to hold the position. The engine might be just screaming that this is a draw through and through, but I think for a human player, practically speaking, this is incredibly, incredibly tough to defend, and we'll just see it play out here. Bishop d6, king g1. This bishop cannot exchange for the knight. There's just no way. Then the pawn is dead, and the two rooks will easily beat the queen in that position. Queen b3. So Nepo here is doing a great job, and it has to be said that while Magnus's moves are easy to play, Nepo's done a great job defending. It's just you can't stop some of the ideas that Magnus has. When the rooks sit like this, attacking this pawn, black doesn't have anything to do except shuffle. Knight d4, and in this position, after king h7, which makes sense to get off the f5 square, you don't want to be sitting on a potential forking square with your pieces. King h2, Magnus is maybe getting off a checking square that black could use in the future. We saw a move here that received, a lot of criticism when it was played. Queen to e4, because it lets Magnus do the thing which I mentioned earlier that maybe has been trying to avoid this whole time, which is give up the rook for the bishop and the pawn. And the resulting position is so solid for white. The rook and knight can coordinate very well. Objectively speaking, that position looks winning for Magnus. So queen e4 was a surprising move because it allowed that. Now, I think what he may have been evaluating is that the knight goes to c2, and it looks like the pawn gets taken. So queen e4, if he can't stop that move, he may as well make another threat. And queen e4 does have another threat. While it allows rook takes a3, it also threatens queen takes h4 check. Now, is it worth giving up the a pawn for the h pawn? Probably not, but I believe, from my eyes, that Nepomniachtchi evaluated knight c2 probably as a win potentially for Magnus. He was achieving his desired goal of taking that a pawn, and as a result, he decided to go with this queen e4 move. But a very tough decision no matter what. Do you allow knight c2 and go for this? There's a lot of tricky lines there that Nepo can still go for. But in this position, Magnus played rook takes a3. Of course, this is the whole plan going forward. Rook takes a3, and if bishop takes a3, rook takes a3, we see the absolute desired outcome for Magnus. This rook's going to go to a5, f5, f4, just to put a few moves on the board there. This rook can't be taken either because white's up a pawn in the endgame. And this position should be winning. The rook goes to f4. I'll even put, a few more moves on the board. The queen basically just kind of moves around. It's not really going anywhere in particular. e4 can be played, knight e3, knight d5, and you just see how everything is protected for white, and you can just gang up on these pawns. So the rook and knight work really well attacking a singular piece or square, and the queen is only one piece, can't defend it, and the queen cannot give itself up for the rook and knight because the king and pawn endgame is winning. So all these things lead to the evaluation. The rook takes a3, bishop a3 looks practically very difficult to play for Nepo here. So he decides to go with his probably initial idea with queen e4 of queen takes h4. He's going to win that pawn, but at what cost? Suddenly after rook a4, we see the rooks are finally free from their shackles. The a pawn is gone. h4, which is the one move to pry open the white king, can't really be played because there's a rook that can simply go take this pawn after the knight moves somewhere. So the knight can move anywhere. Rook takes h4 with check, and white would surely go on to win that. So bishop e5, and this is the final move that really admits that h4 isn't really possible. White discernibly holds the advantage here. After knight e2 attacking the queen, there's not going to be any h4. Rook a2, the rooks get on light squares away from this bishop. The knight's protected. There's no h4 because the rook covers. And after queen b3, king g2, Magnus has achieved his desired position. We're on move 58, getting very close to that 60 moves, where at 60 moves they finally get increment, and Magnus will be able to play this position on forever. This is something that's actually pretty standard in most tournaments. You always get 30 seconds. Most of the top players are used to that. But for this World Championship match, there's no increment until move 60. So the players are on move 58 right now. We see queen d5 check. And as they approach move 60, I think one of the final really crucial decisions that Magnus had to make in this game was seen on the board. Here, after the check, normally what happens when you have a long struggle ahead, and both players are well aware that this game will be played on for a while because, this is such an imbalance. White's better, but it's so marginal, the advantage. You usually don't want to commit things. Like, for example, e4. You don't know if e4 is going to be the correct plan to execute here, so usually you want to leave your pawns where they are, just shuffle your pieces around, try to find the optimal setup, and then maybe strike with a pawn move later on once you're sure of it, once you've calculated it, and certainly once you've reached time control so you have more time to think about it. Here the move king h2 was a very reasonable decision, and everyone was calling for king h2. Why isn't Magnus playing this? h4 right now is covered by the rook. I think after king h2, Nepo's king g7 move was maybe concerning Magnus because now the threat is actually h4. So if I play knight g1, h4, and the idea is like if rook takes h4, this rook is hanging. And if rook g4 check, then of course black's not going to move his king here and give that pawn a check, but he's going to go king f8, and there's no rook a8 check because that's covered. So this pawn can't take either because it's pinned, and black gets to play h takes g3, which is amazing for black and would certainly secure the draw. So what we saw instead was a different move from Magnus. So I think he was concerned about dealing with this h4 move here. What we saw from Magnus was f3. And I think a lot of people did not expect this move at all. Definitely was a consideration, but you just think, oh, you don't want to compromise the structure. You want to leave it nice and solid, everything protecting each other. But before we hit the last time control here and the final 15 extra minutes was added, Magnus played the move f3 and then believe it or not, the move f4 to follow up on move 60. So two of the biggest decisions of the game in my eyes came moves 59 and move 60. f4 was played. This bishop does have to back up, and Magnus gets a nice solid position with king f2, but at the same time, there's no more knight f4, there's no rook going to h4, and these pawns cannot be targeted as easily by the rooks. So f4 was played, bishop to c7, king f2. This protects, everything here is protected. This is very solid for white. And from this point on, it's really tough to explain every single move and what exactly is going on. So before we get into it, I'll just say that generally speaking in this position, black's not trying to do anything in specific. He's just trying to, maybe attack a weakness like this e3 pawn. At some point, if he can do it, maybe queen h1 and h4, just to try to get this king a little bit more open. But really, bishop here, queen here, attack this pawn, use the king to defend all your weak pawns as black, and pretty much just sit there. That's how you play defense here. As white, you're looking to obviously station at least one of the rooks to guard this pawn. You're going to need to. But then somehow you have to use either the rooks together or the rook and knight together to attack one of these pawns and try to force Nepo's pieces to lose coordination a bit. So that's the struggle that we're about to witness as this endgame unfolds. Bishop b6, rook a1, rook e4. So finally, we see both guys are executing their plans. Rook e4, and the rook can sit down here on e8, for example, guarding the e3 pawn. You don't have to worry about the rook having a square. After f5, there's also rook e5. King g7, rook e8, f5, rook a8. There are some ideas to give a check here. Maybe bring the other rook to defend that pawn. So those are definitely on Magnus's mind. And the time is starting to get very low. We're on move 65, and that 15 minutes is ticking down. And the best thing for Magnus about this endgame is that eventually both players will have less than a minute, less than 2 minutes. Like, it's going to get low on time, and that always benefits white here. Because white is the one with the slight edge trying to push it for an advantage, which means that black likely has to play very accurate moves here. If you don't play accurately, you miss one move, you might just lose the game, just like that. But if Magnus plays inaccurately, the worst that can happen is probably a draw here, unless he's blundering a piece or something. So the pressure is really on Nepo for the accuracy. White can just shuffle around forever, but black has to make sure when he's shuffling to the appropriate squares. Queen b4, rook c8, and this is maybe so that after king there's rook to c6 check. Bishop a5, so we see the queen looking to get involved, and believe me, rook here, queen e1, this is just walking into mate. King g2 drops the knight, and king f3 walks into mate. So you cannot allow that at all. Bishop a5, pretty much forced rook to c1 by Magnus. Bishop goes back, rook e5, queen b3, and we see once again Nepo establishing this position where he's just threatening the pawn, and he might be able to bring the king up to guard the pawn, but right now white can't even take it because of e3 hanging. So it's a lot of cat and mouse here, a lot of shuffling, as we see some of the positions repeating. Queen goes down to h1 with queen h2 check. And when the rook goes back, queen h2 he decided against because king f3 or even king e1 to d2 might be possible. And at some point, you might even just feel like your queen is getting trapped in there and it might not be worth it. So he decides to just get right out of there. And hey, if Magnus is not making progress, Nepo doesn't need to change what he's doing. Seems like he's got a very good defensive setup at the moment. And meanwhile, this whole time, of course, all the engines showing triple zeros, draws all around, no advantage. But for the human, looking at this, I think that white is, playing for a win in a very serious capacity. Now we see a lot more shuffling, rook b1, rook e7. So Magnus is going for a different plan. He's starting to target this bishop and try to make it feel uncomfortable. Queen d3, tactically dealing with this, attacking the rook on b1. But now things are changing a little bit as we see the bishop start to get harassed more and more, and this queen has been forced off the nice, b3 square where the e3 pawn could be attacked and the bishop on b6 was defended. Now we have a bishop attacked. The queen can't really stay here, and where does this bishop go, right? All the squares are covered. So if you move off this diagonal a7 to g1 and attacking the e3 pawn and just go here, well, then suddenly white's off the hook. This rook can move, and you definitely don't want to go down that rabbit hole. So queen c2, keeping the bishop there, but now notice the queen and bishop are not teamed up on that pawn. So after rook to b5, bishop a7, Magnus can actually take this pawn. We see him repeat just to gain some time on the clock, but he can take this pawn on f5, and there's nothing black can do about it. Queen d3 to attack this pawn. The rook can just go back to e5 to defend, or so you might think, but there's a nice little trick here. Move queen d3. If you play rook there, bishop takes e3, and if rook takes, you lose the rook. And the cute thing about this is that the tactic is actually available no matter which rook you use. So the real thing after queen d3 is rook f7, of course. You guys all saw that, right? Well, I think the other consideration that Magnus was, well, really putting a lot of time into was rook to g5. But after king to f8, dealing with this move here is very difficult because this rook is the one attacked. And if you go rook e5, you're just walking into f6. And if you bring this rook here, once again, you're giving up the rook on b5 to that same trick. So really crafty stuff by Nepo. Plays queen d3. And how many of us saw Magnus's move coming? Rook takes f7 is just a brilliant move. It's a real shocker. And after king takes f7, rook check, king up, rook takes a7. The only person who can win this game is the current world champion, Magnus Carlsen. We're on move 82. There's a long road ahead. The defense for Nepo here is very tough to explain, but essentially you're trying to stop the pawns from advancing and trying to use your queen to give checks to the king. But white has two pawns plus the rook and knight. And, while the engines continue to give only the slightest edge to white, everyone watching felt that this was getting closer and closer to a Magnus Carlsen victory. And the players had been playing at this point for upwards of 6.5, 7 hours. This is one of the longest games you're ever going to see, and it's still going. Queen d5. The players are now just playing with minutes on their clock. They have the 30-second increment. Again, the moves that you're going to see here are a little bit tough to explain. Not every move has a perfect explanation. A lot of it's just shuffling around, making sure your opponent is, up to snuff, that they're not blundering. If rook a6 check happens, obviously king f5 is being considered by Nepo, but that's a very risky move to play when there's minutes on the clock. Is going up the board the correct answer? With more time to think, Nepo may have decided that actually, yes, king f5 was maybe the best move here. And indeed it was. But so tough to make that decision. We see the play continue, knight d4. One of the things to keep in mind is the setup with knight on f3. The king on f2, knight on f3 makes a really good impression, maybe with the rook on the second rank. Rook behind the pass pawn and just trying to push that is also a very serious idea from Magnus. And we see queen h1. And I think just in general, knight f3 is a good thing to keep in mind here. It stops queen h2 check. It stops h4. Knight f3 is just so perfectly placed, and then you can try to push that pawn. Magnus decides to give a check first, then knight f3, and we see the development of the idea that he's going for. Rook here gets back to d2, and now we're covering all the checks. But Nepo has been defending brilliantly here. His queen's on b1, guarding the e4 square, and notice how his king is not on f7. If it was, maybe the move e4 would be played anyway. Because if the queen took, knight g5 check would fork the king and queen. So the king is on the perfect square, the queen's on the perfect square, and if you play rook e2, which is what Magnus did to try to push this pawn, queen b6 pins it. And if you play if you play king g2, maybe queen b5 attacking the rook, and there's no way the rook can stay guarding the checks here and ready to push the pass pawn without the king protecting it. And you see black has an answer pretty much to every king position that white could have. Rook c2, so Magnus is back to trying other things. And really, we are just kind of shuffling around here, so I'm going to go through the moves a little bit quicker. This is very normal when you down to increment. You're just kind of shuffling around, seeing if there's going to be any opportunity given to you by your opponent. Magnus comes in with the checks, brings the knight back to d4. We've seen this song and dance before. Knight f3. And this is a very familiar position, right? Knight g1. So we finally see a different idea from the world champion. This is a very key moment here. Knight g1, because the idea that Magnus has is, look, there's no way for me to push my pawn like that. Nepo's already demonstrated fantastic defense. But knight to e2, rook to d4, and e4 looks very unstoppable. Knight on e2 guards g3. It guards the rook on d4, and the rook guards the pawn on e4, and there's no pin to worry about because the rook will be in the way. So this is something that Magnus has been calculating in his head. He's been working out, does this actually work? And he's been using all these shuffle moves, gaining 30 seconds every move. He's been using all that time to figure this out. So that's why you see a lot of shuffling in these endgames where it looks so close and you're trying to find the correct plan. Shuffling gives the players that 38-second bonus, and that builds up into enough time that they can actually think about the correct decision and the correct plan going forward. Queen b4. And some more shuffling. We see the rook arrive on d4, knight on e2. And after queen b1, boom, e4. Clearly, Magnus is making some progress in the position. It's not just a dead draw. And there's nothing Nepo could have done about this. So it's nothing, no slight at his defensive technique because he's been playing out of his mind so far. This is such a tough position to defend, and Nepo's been holding it at a computer eval, at least, of zeros the entire time. Some very impressive stuff. And we see the check, rook back, some more shuffling, and finally, h4. The final black pawn is traded off the board. And this is actually a position which is in the table base, right? Once you have, a few number of pieces on the board, 7 or less, the table base can actually be used, which is just, it gives you an immediate evaluation. And the table base evaluation of this position is a draw. That is it. It is a draw. However, the human evaluation, or when you're actually sitting there playing the game, I think it's so far from a draw. I would expect a win here way more often than I would expect a draw. Rook d3. The game continues. If Magnus wants to play this for 10 hours, he can. Because you play 50 moves, or you play 49 moves, then make a pawn move, you get 50 more moves to play. That's how the 50 move rule works. So there's no risk of this being a draw by 50 moves or anything like that. Black is just trying to give some checks here. The king is rerouting, and players are just jockeying for position at the moment. Waiting for that right moment is Magnus before he pushes these pawns, because you push prematurely, you start to open up the king to more checks. You got to make sure your king is safe, and your pieces can be used to block the checks from the queen. Very, very tricky endgame. Not one that I profess, to have a great understanding of. This is a very unique endgame, and in fact, the whole game has been unique. From the 2 rooks for the queen imbalance earlier, all the way to this. It's just been a fantastic and fascinating game. But something else I want to point out, the move rook d2 has also made history in the World Chess Championship for the longest game ever played. That is the 125th move. Previously, 124 moves was the record. So guys, this is the longest World Chess Championship game ever played in history, which is just remarkable. I mean, really, really fascinating stuff. Both guys are exhausted. It's well over 7 hours now. And the players are completely dead, and they're in one of the most complicated, positions to ever have from either side. Defending this as Nepo has got to just be the most gruesome task, especially after how long they've been playing. And I mean, it's just phenomenal that it's gone on this long. E5, Magnus finally goes with the pawn. And according to the table bases, this move, queen e6 from Nepo, was the one move that threw away the table base draw, and suddenly Magnus gets into a winning position. But if you ask me, there was going to be a moment in all these positions where Nepo is going to have to find a singular move. That's how, table-based draw works. It's if you play perfectly, yes, the evaluation is a draw. But it's so hard to play, the perfect move every time. Us humans, we can defend, all the time. We can defend positions and turn them into draws. But this one in particular, there's so many variables with these pieces. And look at all the squares that the black queen has to move to, right? It's just incredible to think that you have to choose the right exact square every single time. This was a case where queen e6 was the wrong square. Magnus gets a winning position. But if you ask me, this has been a push for Magnus to win for a very long time here. And it did not surprise me to see that queen e6, a blunder was eventually going to happen. King h4, and the knight blocks. Now there are no more checks, and with the king position, Magnus's pawns start to advance. This is a very cute one. You see queen takes f5, allows knight to g7, which would be winning due to the fork. Queen g6, rook f7, another beautiful move. If queen takes e6, knight g7 check, and although black gets all these pieces, king g5 goes into a winning king and pawn endgame. Just crazy. After all that's been done, said and done in this game, it comes down to something as basic as this. One of the first things we learn in chess endgames. So rook f7, cannot take that pawn. The king's moving out of the way of the checks, but now f5, the pawns connect. And after knight g7, e7 check and e8 is a forced win if that happens. Yes, there are some checks that black can give the white king, but it's pretty easy to see the zigzag down to g8. There's no way to do anything about that. The king is going to find shelter, and the game will end with e7 and e8 by Magnus. Nepo understood this and actually resigned in this position, which means that Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi not only played the longest game ever at 136 moves in the World Chess Championship game number 6, but also we have a decisive result for the first time in a long time. The World Chess Championship match between Karyakin and Carlsen, also Caruana and Carlsen, did not have a decisive game in the classical portion. Now we have a decisive game. Finally, game number 6. It has been a roller coaster. I am sure that I've left things out of this recap. There's simply so much to talk about. I feel like this recap could have been hours long, but I tried to keep it as concise as possible while still highlighting the key moments and the major imbalances that we've seen. I also want to just say that I think this is one of the most entertaining games I have personally seen in a really long time. Huge imbalances from both players willing to take imbalances. Queen against two rooks, knight against bishop, rook and knight against queen. There's so much content in this game that it was just a pleasure to watch, and I hope you guys enjoyed the recap. I hope it made it a little bit easier to understand, but to be quite honest with you, this was one of the most high-level games ever played, and both players were a little bit shaky. Time trouble played a part. There's so many elements to this game, but truly one of the most enjoyable games that I've seen in a long time. So that is the recap for game number 6 of the World Chess Championship. Tomorrow we are going to have game 7, and I will be here with another recap then. So we'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope you enjoyed the recap.